Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Memi Karambai. I'm a registered psychotherapist, and today I want to talk about empathy and burnout and how we can try to beat burnout by using some empathy. So, our agenda for today, we're going to go over defining what burnout is. So, looking at the risk, the symptoms, the different stages. We're also going to talk about, how to address the situation as a manager, for instance. How do you go about talking to your employees? Or if you are a person going through burnout, what can you do? What can you put in place in order to prevent it? And then we're going to have a conversation with a colleague of mine all about prevention, as well as recovery, as well as empathy and what it looks like when we want to talk about burnout. Okay, so defining burnout. What does it mean when we're talking about burnout? Burnout is a state of emotional, mental, and often physical exhaustion that is brought out by prolonged or repeated stress. And so when we're talking about burnout, we're often talking about work-related activities that is causing us a lot of exhaustion. But another thing to keep in mind is that you can be burned out because of maybe parental duties that you have at home, or if you're taking care of other people, or even in romantic relationships, right? So burnout is not necessarily tied to work-related issues. And so I thought it was interesting to put a bit more perspective by giving some numbers here. So thanks to Statistics Canada, as well as the Mental Health Research Canada, we have a couple of numbers here. So as I was saying, burnout is not only due to work-related stress, but 62% of workers say that their main source of stress is due to work. And so we have also other sources of stress, which include finances, which was at 12% with time. And then we had family at 8% and then other 6%. So a big chunk of stress is coming from work related task issues and things like that. And 35% of all working Canadians said that they were feeling burnt out. So this is in this past year. Okay, so I think that gives us a little bit of perspective of the amount of people that not only are burnt out, but are also burnt out due to work. And so I do want to take the time also to give that difference between what is stress and what is burnout. So if we're looking at the two topics here, stress is a feeling of over engagement. Your emotions are overactive. There's that sense of urgency, like it has to be now. You have to finish certain things right now. There's hyperactivity. Whereas burnout, it's more in terms of disengagement. Your emotions are distant. You're feeling helpless or hopeless. And when you're comparing it to stress, burnout, you're really having a loss of motivation, loss of your ideas, loss of hope. Whereas stress, you're having a loss of energy. And stress can actually lead to anxiety disorders, versus burnout is leading to depressive disorders. And so the real difference between the two is how stress basically takes a physical toll on the body, whereas burnout takes more of that emotional toll, right? You're feeling distance, your hopes, hopeless, helplessness is kicking in. And so that is that difference when we're thinking about stress and burnout. And so there are a couple of risk factors to pay attention to and to take into consideration. When we're talking about external factors, for instance, we're referring to having a high demand job, for instance, or having a lack of positive feedback. You could be maybe working long hours and you have no idea if your work is taken into consideration, if it's appreciated. That will affect your morale. If there's a lot of time pressure, everything is time sensitive. Every time, everything feels like it has to be done now. This can also be a risk. If there's poor teamwork, there's not enough resources available for you. So a lot of things is falling on your shoulders in terms of responsibilities, in terms of workload. And then overall, if you have a negative atmosphere, maybe there's harassment at work, maybe there's bullying, those kind of things where you're always a sense of tension in your surrounding will be a high risk for you. And when we're talking about internal factors, maybe there is that strong need of recognition. And so, like I was saying earlier, if you're not getting that, that's going to cause a risk factor for you. Maybe you're suppressing your own needs. A lot of people are taking care of others, maybe as a parent, maybe as just a caretaker for another individual, maybe even as a manager, you have a lot of responsibilities on your shoulders. So you tend to suppress your own needs for the better good of your team or the better good of the family, depending on what the role is in the moment. And sometimes you're substituting your own social life for work. So sometimes I have my clients who said that, they're workaholics and they love to work and they're working so hard and they have no time for nothing else but work. Even though it is commendable that you are able to put so much effort into your work, it also questions of, why you are only having that and there's no other source, right? There's no work-life balance because in the long run, it's not going to be sustainable for you. And if work is also the only meaningful activity for you, if things are not going well at work, then that's going to give you a lot of pressure and having that self-doubt because there's nothing else that is meaningful in your life. So then you have higher risk of burnout because you're really putting your all because that's the only thing in your life that has to work because nothing else for you is meaningful at the time. And sometimes we feel burnout when there is that feeling of irreplaceable. A lot of people have a hard time taking vacation because they feel that, if I'm gone, who's going to take over? I just cannot leave. My position does not allow me to leave. And therefore, they're never taking the time off that they need. And then this can lead to burnout as well. Okay, so some symptoms to pay attention to. There's the behavioral changes as well as cognitive changes. And when I said symptoms, I really wanted to more related to the different changes that are occurring, right? So, for instance, behavioral changes, you're maybe absent more often at work, maybe you're becoming late more often, right? Usually, you are on time or you're there at a certain time, but now you're maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour late, or maybe you're not even showing up. There could be also a drop in productivity and your own motivation, as well as lack of cooperation with the team. You no longer want to participate, or you could find yourself even crying at work in your office or in a team meeting. So those will be those sort of behavioral changes that are not normal from your day to day. In terms of cognitive changes, there's loss of focus, you can't concentrate, you're maybe having memory issues, your decision making is not the greatest, you're making a lot of mistakes. Those will be the type of changes that you're witnessing. And in terms of physical changes, it's really about fatigue, maybe sleep disorders, you're having a hard time sleeping, or you're waking up really early and you can't fall asleep anymore. There's unexplained weight loss or weight gain, so a lot of changes when it comes to that. Maybe you're having those physical pains, or like headaches, backaches, sometimes even neck aches. So different muscle aches in general. Maybe you're having heart palpitations. Those are the symptoms that are starting to show up when we're in that burnout stage. And in terms of psychological mood changes, you're having a low mood. Like I say, burnout is very more like that depressive state. Maybe you're feeling lost, you're feeling overwhelmed. Maybe you have less patience, so that you're going to be more aggressive or more irritable or easily getting irritated. You really have that lower energy. You're detached, you're indifferent, and that low self-esteem is kicking in, right? So you're especially when you have really high standard, because you're overwhelmed and you're burned out, you're not meeting them, and so now you're judging yourself for not being able to meet these different standards. And there's different stages to this, burnout, right? And I did put like 2 arrows because you could be good and then get back into a burnout phase and then sort of come back. And so the first stage is the honeymoon stage. Like, let's say you have a new job, or you're working on a new project, you're excited, everything is going well, you're super motivated, your productivity levels are really high, everything is going great. Then we have the onset of stress. And so in that period, you're noticing that there is some days where you're more stressed or there's more difficulty than others. So for instance, maybe you started a new project and there's another project that's coming up. And so you have to combine your schedule for the two of them. So you're still able to handle things, but there's definitely more stress coming up. Then there's the chronic stress. That is when the symptoms now become more critical. So some of those symptoms that I'm mentioning, maybe you're feeling a little bit more tired, you have maybe more headaches, maybe you're more irritable. Those symptoms are starting to show up, and you have difficulty coping. Or using those coping strategies. For instance, maybe if you have a meeting where you get really upset, you may want to go for a walk, and usually you do one round across the neighborhood, and that tends to calm you down. But you're noticing that even after that, you're still feeling stressed, feeling on edge. And then so you might do something else, like maybe, go for a run or talk to a friend in order to calm you down. So you need more of those coping strategies. And then we have the habitual burnout. And that's when you're experiencing significant ongoing physical or emotional problems. So, in those times, all of those symptoms that I was talking earlier are more present in your day to day. And those are the changes that you're now noticing. And then we have the window of tolerance. This is important because that's the window of time where you're going to be able to function most effectively. So this will help you avoid, or being paying attention to when you're getting to that stage of burnout. So for instance, in that window of tolerance, you're grounded, you're flexible, you're open, you're curious, you're really present, you're able to emotionally self-regulate, and that's really that important piece because you're able to self-regulate, able to use your coping strategies. And then depending on the situation, if you're on arousal, you're shutting down, you're withdrawn, you're numb, you're freezing, there's shame, there's depression, and there's passiveness. And above the window of tolerance is hyperarousal, which is high energy, anxiety, hypervigilance, fight or flight, anger, chaotic, overwhelmed. And even if with what we're talking, it's sort of maybe hyperarousal is more like that stress level versus hyperarousal is getting that to that burnout level. But really paying attention, what are the symptoms that you're starting to notice that would mean that you're outside of your window of tolerance, which would mean that in terms of productivity, engagement, that sort of thing, you're not going to be that effective. And so paying attention to that. And then later on, we'll be talking about, what are the things that you could do in terms of prevention or coping strategies to help you with that. Okay. So addressing the situation. Now, if you're finding that there's one of your colleagues who has these signs of burnout, try to be, first of all, watching out for those signs now that you are aware of them. And then ask them, how are you? How are you doing? Especially if you've noticed that this person is not quite the same anymore. Really make sure that you're coming with an approach of empathy and no judgment, right? Instead of being like, oh, you're late again, maybe saying, I've noticed that you've been late. Is everything going on? How are you doing? Right? That tone difference and the type of question that you're asking will make that difference for the person you're talking to. Try to offer support while also respecting their limits, right? So people might be embarrassed and ashamed and might not be really quick to open up with what's going on with them. And so automatically they might be on the defense level, or they might not want any help because maybe they don't realize that things are getting bad. So, offer that help, but respect their limits if they're not comfortable with that yet. And if you can, refer them to any resources, remind them maybe of the EAP program that's available, services like Dialogue, where people can have support from different mental health specialists. And as a managers with employees, there's a couple of steps that you can do in order to prepare for these kind of things or these conversations. So for starters, identify what is the problem and really doing that by some facts, right? So if you're noticing that this person is late, 3 times out of the week, those are observable facts that you've noticed. Try to schedule a meeting with them, making sure that there's enough time. These meetings are not going to be 20 minutes long. Maybe save yourself an hour, making sure that, in case it goes over, you still have some time because you just never know how the meeting could go, and try to anticipate the employee's possible reaction. So if the person is, they might be upset, they might be crying, they might be very angry and frustrated, in the different scenarios, how would you react, right? Trying to make sure that, it's not because of you, they're probably going through something, and trying to see what you can give them in those moments in terms of resources that might be useful depending on how they're reacting. And how do you intervene in those situations? You just share your concern. You continue to present the problems with the facts of what you have observed, right? The projects are not done on time, there's lateness, there's absenteeism, or you lashed out at somebody for asking you questions. Those are some of those observable facts that you would have noticed. And when you finish, before finishing those meetings, making sure that you're providing them some support mechanism. Like, what are the things that are available, the resources, the EAP, whatever it is. Maybe it's getting another colleague to work on a project with them, or maybe assisting them with a project that they're having a hard time finishing. And then when you're done with this meeting, you want to make sure that it's going to be a follow up. Is it in 2 weeks from now? If that's enough time, 3 weeks, a month from now, however amount of time it is, making sure that you're first, checking in with the employee of, okay, when should we have this follow up, so that they know and they prepare themselves, and then that follow up will be checking in on, are we still observing the same things? Is there improvement, or are things getting worse? And that addressing the situation for ourselves, right? Let's not forget about ourselves too. Pay attention to how you're feeling, your emotions, your reactions, the different symptoms that you may be having. Try to learn to establish and maintain boundaries, right? At work, maybe your team tends to have longer meetings that go way above the time. So that would be setting up boundaries, because what ends up happening is your day is now pushed, or you don't have enough time to do your tasks. So really paying attention to the different boundaries that will be helpful for you to have that work-life balance. And try to adopt, those are the things that I always say, like, those are the things the doctor always tells us, and we know them, but we don't always do them, and myself included. But, eating healthy, exercising, having good sleeping habits, really being mindful to make sure that you're actually doing those things, because those is helping your immune system be stronger, and it's going to be able to, that window of tolerance being wider for you to be able to tolerate certain things. Try to delegate to others as much as possible, right? So, for instance, if even at home, right, maybe having somebody else at home help with some of the tasks, so it doesn't fall all on you, or at work, maybe really making sure that the work is divided equally. However that looks like, don't put everything on your shoulders in terms of trying to do everything, and try to learn how to manage your stress as well in different ways, right? Building up that toolbox for your different coping strategies. So, sometimes a walk outside is going to work, sometimes it's not. So, in the times that it's not, what else is useful? Is it, meditating, calling a friend, watching a show, reading a book, whatever it is that you find is helpful, breathing exercises that is helpful to reduce your stress. And even starting your day with a relaxing ritual, maybe, especially if, like, let's say you're working on a really big project that's very stressful for you, maybe try to start a day with feeling relaxed so that you're having that energy to take on whatever is coming for you during that day. Creating that work life balance, make sure that you have times where you unplug, right? Like at the end of the day, making sure what's your ritual to close off your laptop and really end that day, or unplug completely from emails on the weekends. Maybe not having, if you have an email or an app for work, maybe turning off the notification on your phone, or not even having that on your phone, so you're not tempted to look at those. So what are the different ways that you can try to unplug, or take time off if needed, to just completely relax if you're feeling overwhelmed? And then during this time, connecting with your family and your friends, or finding hobbies that interest you, or activities that you like to do. And most important of all, if you notice that things, despite all of those things, are still really hard, or you're having a really hard time, it's okay for you to ask for help, right? Reach out to different professionals that can assist you. Is maybe it's a doctor, a family doctor, a therapist, or your EAP, such as Dialogue, where, like I was saying, we have different mental health specialists and psychotherapists that are there to assist you as well. All right, so I've done enough of the talking. Now we're going to have a chat with Karen Barclay. She is a psychotherapist working for Dialogue as well on the platform. And so she'll be able to tell us a little bit more about her experience. So, hi, Karen. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. I just wanted to give you that opportunity to introduce yourself and say a bit of your background.
Hi, Memi. Thank you for having me. So, my name is Karen Barclay, and I'm a registered psychotherapist in Ontario. And I have a really wide range of experience, so I won't waste a lot of time going through it. But I've worked with a really broad population and really, really like working in mental health. And of course, it's much more challenging these days than it ever has been before. Um, but I think that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is just how people are coping with everything that's going on in the world today and managing to work anyway. Yeah.
Exactly. And that even sort of brings me to that first question that I had, was to sort of ask you, what have you noticed with your clients when it comes to burnout?
Yeah. So I think primarily what I'm noticing with my clients is that a lot more people are away from work these days.
Mhm.
People feel very anxious about the instability in the world. It's very dystopic, I think, with the rise of the right in the world, the politics, war in Ukraine and Russia, and global warming, all these issues. And then on top of it, lack of colleagues at work, people falling out of work with COVID, being sick, being burnt out, and the added stress that's putting on people as well. And I'm finding certain industries, it's particularly true, like insurance industry and the banking industry. It seems more than ever that these individuals are being called on to deal with irate customers and people
Yeah,
who are stressed, so that adds an extra layer to their work. So that, and on top of it too, people don't have the supports they had before. Like moms are working at home with their young kids, or were. They worry about their children at school or at daycare, and they're having to go and get them a lot, so they need to take a lot of time off. And just all those added stresses, are caring for elderly loved ones, and all it means in this context. So there's a lot of stress out there.
absolutely. And you're raising so many good points, even in terms of not having that support that people used to rely on, in terms of even their coping strategies, like the gyms were closed for a really long time, or not being able to travel. Some people enjoy to have that break in their day to day. And so not having those general sources of coping strategies available to them.
Yeah, that too. Not only the added stress, but yes, you're right, exactly. Not having recourse to the kinds of things that helped them before. Even working at home
Mhm.
can be an enormous, as much as it's a boon to some people, it can be an enormous stress as well. Not having the reinforcements of a little chat with a colleague for 5 minutes. How's it going? That kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And I was wondering, for people who are in position of caring for others, what would you say would be beneficial for them in terms of preventing burnout?
I think that's such a it requires a multi-pronged approach. So the more supports you can have, the more approaches you take to caring for yourself, um, the better off you'll be. So, and that's of course a privilege. Not everyone has access to being able to care for themselves the way they might like to. So I think it's about being in an optimal environment. So having employers that are aware and proactive in making sure you're in a work environment that's um, palliating to some of those needs that were there before, and being innovative and putting in new supports that might not have been there prior that are needed now.
Mhm.
So flexibility at work, and then being really super creative about how you communicate with people, because we know that human beings are optimally well. Their neurotransmission is optimized for wellness in relationship to other people. So just being with other people is so important to our wellness and how we feel inside and regulating ourselves. So I think it's so important. What so many people have done is get used to technology. And I know that my son was in a school, for example, that made sure every child had a laptop or
Mm,
access to a laptop, and these were delivered to the homes. And I think it was a wonderful investment in mental health where we were living at that time. And I think a lot of schools have done that kind of initiative to make sure that students had that eye to eye support from their teachers and peers. So I think that kind of initiative is really, really important. So it's about not just what you can do for yourself.
mhm.
I always say to people, like, if you can't go to Italy, how can you bring Italy to you? So I encourage people to do things like experiment with Italian cuisine. Maybe learn a little bit of Italian. Don't have the goal of mastering the language, but just learn a little bit. Um, uh, Buy yourself an excellent olive oil and do that kind of thing. So I think that it's also about managing our expectations of
Yeah,
ourselves, and
yeah.
maybe taking it down a notch and saying to ourselves, maybe in these times my focus and priorities have to be different,
Mhm.
and I won't be able to maybe achieve um, the same level of um, stress management as I could before. So it's gonna be really important that I focus on where I'm gonna be the most effective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love that. If you can't go to Italy, bring Italy to you. It's like really, that reality of adapting whatever the situation is, now adapting your wellness around that in order for you to have the best possible outcome, basically.
Right, and staying flexible, right? Staying flexible
Flexible.
in your way of looking at things. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And so for people who might already be in that burnout stage, how do you recover from burnout?
Again, I think it's multi-pronged, and I think um, it's really indicative. Once you're there, it becomes a little bit more challenging to get out, so prevention is always key, and recognizing the signs that you're heading towards burnout
Mhm,
is really key. And I think it really behooves employers as well to be sort of aware and talking to their staff about that. And again, going back to what I talked about, being proactive with your employees, creating the kind of environment that can be protective. Um, but I think it's again multi-pronged, adjusting your expectations, reaching out to the help available. A lot of people, as you know, like we're an EAP company, so we work a lot with that and encourage people to call us and just get that assistance. A lot of people think that mental health supports are for, if you're having a breakdown or
mhm,
but you don't wait till your car is absolutely not working to bring it to the garage. And so we encourage people to come and see us to just work on stress management. And I would always recommend to people the same kinds of things I mentioned before about dealing with stress, like How can you what are your goals when it comes to stress management? What let's identify the things that you used before when you were feeling well, and let's see how we can put some things in place in a new way to have the same effect. It might not be the same thing, but something new, something creative, and something that you can use right now to feel better. So again, it's about being in the right environment, creating the right environment, separating work and home, setting limits, finding pleasure in your day, and finding socialization. And then if it gets more serious and it falls into a deeper anxiety or depression, getting the right mental health care to address that and the right medical care to address that.
You said something that I think if we could touch on a little bit deeper in terms of creating, separating that work life. So, in terms of doing that work life balance, especially for, a lot of us have been working from home, it's kind of hard to separate. So, what do you think would be great strategies in order to help somebody attain that?
So I think this is where employers and employees really need to communicate because it's a dual effort. I think that it starts with tolerance. Like, I'm working from home too, and I have pets. They might bark, right? So I find that people are very tolerant of that. We are using our homes to work from, so I mean, there has to be a degree of latitude, right? A degree uh, of acceptance that it's not going to be the same as being in a formal office.
Mhm,
So I think that's really important that employers support their employees that way. I think employers that have been really flexible have been really helpful, like in scheduling and time, because I know a lot of employees have. Children at home. And so the 3 o'clock hour when they come in, they have a lot of needs. So I know that the employees I've met with that on the platform, they've been really happy, and it's been very helpful to them when their employers are very flexible.
mhm,
And they've really appreciated that. And having the option to come back into the office or not, according to what their family needs are. So all those types of things about adjusting your environment, and then even at home, like trying to work in a place where, like, let's say I find a lot of people are working in their basements and they don't have windows, right?
yeah.
So I always encourage those people to make sure they get upstairs on their break or get outside on their break and put on their winter coat and boots. And I said, maybe that's not that fun, but once you're outside and you get a bit of fresh air, you're going to feel better.
Mm,
So about um, I encourage people not to reason with their emotions, oh, I don't feel like it, but to reason with the outcomes, right? Like to be faith, have the faith that doing certain actions will make them feel better. So it's really about organizing your workspace. And one thing I found really important, because I do work at a distance from my team, and even the type of work I do is not really engaging with my team so much,
mhm,
is I really set my limits around making sure that any opportunity I have at my work to be with my colleagues, like team meetings or clinical meetings, that I make the time to be there and it's blocked off on my schedule.
mhm,
But I also try to communicate more with my team and just have those informal opportunities by writing to them or sending them an email or noticing something about them and giving them some feedback. Like the other day, I saw a colleague had the most beautiful earrings on, and I wrote to her and I just said, your earrings are so beautiful. I just wanted to tell you that. And I know when I get a compliment like that, it kind of gives me a little boost, and it not because they're noticing my earrings so much, but because they're noticing me and they took the time to tell me and share with me. So I think these are the little ways that we can support each other and have that contact, that human contact that's so important for our well-being.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love what you're saying, even in terms of like being more intentional with what you're doing, right? So the fact that you're saying you're going to put some intention in these meetings or talking to your colleagues whenever you can, because you may feel isolated depending on the type of job that you have. That's also really important because it's you're really doing that effort towards something that is going to be helpful for your own well-being.
Exactly. And I think too, engaging the family a little bit in
Yes.
you know, we are so used to not managing the family within our workspace, and
Mhm.
now we do have to. So I think that we, as much our employers need to have that tolerance. Like I've seen since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been in meetings with little children present and so forth, and we have to have that tolerance, right? Like it's not. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think some positive things are going to come out of this pandemic. um, but I think the other piece is working with our older children as much as possible to have them work with us to allow us our work time and to have something set up for them to do and have them respect some boundaries, right? And create some guidelines for them around knocking on that door,
Yeah,
like, you know,
just
I
bargaining.
have a sign that says "in session," and I always let my children are adults, but I let them know, like, I'm
Yeah.
in session, so if you're gonna have a argument with each other, could you do it somewhere else, you know?
Exactly. And that actually relates to my next question. You're talking about being more um, mindful about what people are going through, right? That's our new reality is some of these things and those aspects. And so one of the theme of this webinar is really using empathy to, beat burnout. And so what would you say, first of all, is your definition of empathy, and how would you recommend people to um, basically deal with burnout with an empathetic approach?
I often think of, empathy as being, a little bit like looking at people with soft eyes, right? So it's the opposite of judging people and really creating that space for people to be themselves, to talk about the realities of what they're going through with a sense that they will be supported and heard. And beyond being heard, being supported and being an active problem solver with them, right? I often think as a psychotherapist, I often think half the battle as a therapist is understanding people and letting them feel that. I think so often we judge ourselves so harshly. And I think people who do tend to have more problems with stress judge themselves more harshly than other people. They might feel like they need to be really perfect. They might be exceptional employees. They might always be the one that is volunteering to help. Often those individuals are the first ones to question themselves when they're not maintaining the same levels they were before. So I feel that empathy, working as a therapist, working with people with empathy is just helping them sort of look at themselves, help them look at themselves with the same soft eyes that I will look at them with, and to help them understand themselves and know that not everything that they experience is a personal failure,
Mhm,
that there's environments that optimize our wellness and environments that minimize our ability or create barriers to us being really well.
mhm,
And um and I also try and really legitimize their experience, right? Like, yes, it makes sense, this makes a ton of sense that you're feeling this way. And I encourage them to work to problem solve on those different levels that I've been talking about with their environments, the different environments they interface with, and their own internal space. And often talk about, the hardships that life presents, right? The normal day to day losses and grief that we'll experience throughout living. Like, if we're going to love, we're going to hurt as well.
mhm,
And if we're going to engage and be passionate about things, we're also going to experience loss and grief and disappointment. And so there's those feelings that we experience, and then there's the judgments, the misery we create for ourselves through our own judgment, right? And I think that's the greatest joy in working with people, is bringing them from a place of judgment to a place of self-understanding and an ability to really set some limits and reclaim their interior space and free themselves, um, to feel good and to feel that they can move ahead with the things that they're passionate about, or put a hole in everything, and that productivity is not the end all be all of existence either, right? So
yeah.
putting things in perspective. Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, you said something and I had to write it down. You said that, being an active problem solver.
Yeah.
I think that is really, really key because if, especially if you're noticing a coworker, or as a manager, you're noticing one of your employee or a family member that's going through burnout. Be instead of sort of judging them for, they're not doing this and their change and whatever they're noticing, helping them in terms of like, okay, this is what you're going through, how can we help you move forward. The onus is not only on them, it's also even with their environment and the people around them. So having that team approach to help them in their situation. And a lot of even, for me too, a lot of my clients, they're going to tell me all of the different things that they went through, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like how are you still, going to work and doing all of these different things, and they don't seem to see it. And so that aspect of, looking at yourself with soft eyes and having that compassion for yourself, for what you're going through, and changing that perspective as well is really, really key.
Yeah, I think it's really hard, and I'm not the first one to say this. We know that it's really hard to make changes from a place of self-blame and self-judgment, right? It's more about asking ourselves, is what I'm after really aligned with my values?
Mhm.
And is this really what I want? And if it is really what I want, how can I get there without whipping myself there, right? How can I walk beside myself and feel joy about what it is I'm doing? Yeah. And
Absolutely.
so I think sometimes employers um, might more effectively ask themselves the same question when it comes to their employees, instead of having, for example, instead of having absenteeism programs where they step you up to,
Yeah.
which just stresses out people more because people can't be creative when they're very stressed, right? We know that. Like if you're in a state of high stress, you can't be creative and innovative and problem solve.
Yeah.
So I think it would really be worthwhile for employers to say, if they see their absenteeism going up, is what can we do to optimize an environment where people don't feel they need to, where people feel happy coming to work. Yeah.
Yeah. Sort of
How
that
can we enhance it?
engagement. Yeah.
Yeah. And if they need to be away from work for a while, because sometimes that's really what people need,
Mhm.
how can we give them that without stressing them and having them worry that their work's going to be there when they come back, or that they won't have the help they need moving forward? How can we make, going back to being an active problem solver, how can we look at this person's work and make some changes now or forever to respond to what they're going through right now? Yeah. Yeah.
Like, thank you so much. This was a great conversation.
Yeah.
I think it's a much needed conversation, and as especially hearing it from a psychotherapist who is dealing with hearing a lot of people who deal with burnout. So I'm really happy that we were able to have this conversation.
Mamie, it was absolutely my pleasure. It was lovely speaking with you today. Yeah.
Perfect. Wow. Well, here we go. We're at the end of this webinar talking about burnout, but especially about beating burnout with empathy. And so here are a few takeaways that I will hope that you'll be able to remember from this discussion. First of all, it's important for you to identify your risk factors, right? What are the different risk factors that you have? Are they internal? Are they external? Be also aware of your own tolerance level. There is different levels that you may being late or stuck in traffic. One day could be, well, that's fine. I'm just listening to my music. And another day you may be really, really tensed or on the verge of tears or, really, really upset. So those are the difference in the sort of same activities and how that can impact you. So being aware of those tolerance level. Pay attention to your symptoms as well. Are you feeling tired? Are you feeling, you're not sleeping well, you're not eating well, you're irritated, those type of things. And as soon as you notice that, act at the sign of the first signs, make sure that you act on them. What is it that you need to do in order to help you? Is it, establishing those boundaries, learning what those boundaries are, establishing them, maintaining them, finding coping strategies to help you manage the stress. What works for you? What do you need to do? And making sure that sometimes you take that time to unplug, to take that time to take it off and actually be off and not still be on vacation on weekends and then working on your different work that you have to do. And then if you need help, ask for help. There's nothing wrong with needing a little bit more support in order to avoid getting to the point of burnout. So even for yourself, please use a little bit of empathy when it comes to uh, recovery as well as avoiding burnout. All right, well, that's it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, with us regarding the webinar and this topic. We're going to be here online for a couple minutes longer. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat. There's going to be moderators that are going to be there to answer you, as well as myself. If you have any questions, even later on, you could always send us an email at support@dialogue.co. Thank you. Bye.